Atheist professor mocked Jesus Christ, but Sandra Bullock's calm response stunned the entire class. The grand lecture hall at Stanford University buzzed with chatter. Some students were genuinely interested, others were just there for the course credit. But everyone was curious about Professor Daniel Warren's discussion today. Warren walked up to the podium, straightened his jacket, and scanned the room. A slight smile appeared on his lips. He wasn't just a scholar, he was a showman. Today, he wouldn't just make his students think, he would shake their beliefs. Spreading his arms wide, he said, "We're in the 21st century. Science has advanced. We've been to space, split the atom. And yet millions of people still believe in an invisible being." A soft chuckle rippled through the room. Some students nodded, others avoided eye contact. But for Warren, the real question was this: if there's a loving God, why do bad things happen? A brief silence followed. Warren asked this question at least once every year. Some students had heard this debate before. The front row students were too easy. He wanted a real challenge. And then he found her. Sandra Bullock. She sat in the back, her head tilted down, focused on her notebook. But when she felt Warren's gaze, she lifted her head. Warren smiled. "Are you a believer, Sandra?" A murmur spread through the room. The game had begun. Sandra placed her pen on the desk. No hesitation, no surprise. Yes. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A few students held their breath. Some glanced at Sandra with curiosity, while others quickly looked away. Warren nodded. "Then tell me this. If God exists, why do bad things happen?" A few students stopped taking notes. Sandra's face remained neutral. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't defensive. She simply looked at Warren. Silence stretched on. Warren tilted his head. Most students would scramble for a defense or try to change the subject. But Sandra was different. And Warren could feel the rhythm shifting. Warren locked eyes with Sandra. At this point, most students either scrambled for a defense or hesitated. But Sandra didn't flinch. The professor tilted his head slightly. "No answer?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. Sandra shook her head. "I don't answer the wrong question." A murmur spread through the room. For a brief moment, Warren's expression shifted, but he quickly recovered. "The wrong question?" he echoed. "Then what's the right one?" Without breaking eye contact, Sandra replied, "You always ask, why doesn't God stop evil? But the real question is, why don't we?" A low hum of whispers filled the room. Warren furrowed his brows. This wasn't the kind of answer he was used to. Leaning against the podium, he asked, "So you're saying stopping evil is our responsibility?" Sandra nodded. "If people suffer and God is the only one to blame, then we bear no responsibility, right? But our choices shape the world too." Some students turned toward Sandra, their expressions ranging from intrigued to stunned. "What about natural disasters? Diseases? Are we responsible for those too?" Warren challenged. Sandra paused for a moment. "Life is fragile, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. If we feel the pain of loss, it means that what we lost mattered." The room fell silent. Warren studied Sandra intently. He wanted to corner her, but she wasn't backing down. "Then what about us?" Warren pressed. "What meaning do we take from it?" Sandra smiled slightly. "Pain can make us better people, but only if we choose to let it." Some students had stopped taking notes. Others sat quietly, weighing her words. Warren was still watching her closely. this debate wasn't over yet. Warren leaned back against the podium. The room was unusually silent. Normally, by this point, a student would laugh, signaling Warren's intellectual victory. But this time was different. Sandra wasn't backing down. The professor nodded. "An interesting perspective," he said. "But something is still missing. If God exists and evil is our responsibility, then what's the point of God?" A few students looked up. Warren expected Sandra to hesitate, but she remained calm. "What's the point of you, Professor?" she asked. A low murmur spread through the room. Warren raised his eyebrows. "I'm sorry?" Sandra kept her gaze steady. "You teach students to ask the right questions, but even when they give the wrong answers, you don't abandon them, do you?" Warren tilted his head. "And what exactly are you comparing that to?" Sandra shrugged. "I think that's what God does. He doesn't control us, but he doesn't abandon us either." A student rubbed his chin. "So, we have to figure everything out on our own?" Sandra turned to him. "Sometimes we have to make mistakes in order to grow." Warren leaned against the podium's edge. Sandra wasn't just defending herself. She was leading the conversation now. "All right," Warren said. "If God is just watching, then why do we pray?" Sandra met his gaze without blinking. "Because sometimes we can't change things. But when we have to change, we don't have to do it alone." The room grew even quieter. "So, prayer is just a way to feel better?" Warren asked. Sandra smiled slightly. "No, prayer is a reminder that we're not alone." A student broke the silence. "But what if God isn't real?" Sandra turned to him. "Then wouldn't we still be here for each other?" The classroom fell into silence. This time it wasn't a challenge, it was awareness. This conversation wasn't over. Warren leaned against the podium. He was usually the one steering the conversation. But today, the balance had shifted. Sandra wasn't just defending herself, she was driving the discussion. The professor took a deep breath. "All right then, what about pain? If prayer is a reminder that we're not alone, how does someone who's suffering feel God's presence?" Sandra shook her head. "Maybe we're the ones who need to make them feel it." Warren's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" Sandra's voice remained calm. "We can keep asking whether God exists, but the real question is, if we believe, isn't it our responsibility to make that belief real for others?" A student raised his hand. "Are you saying we're supposed to show God's love?" Sandra turned to him. "If love and compassion are given to us, aren't we meant to use them?" Some students put their pens down. Others stared into space, lost in thought. One student broke the silence. "If we're God's hands, then why do people still suffer?" Sandra looked at him. "Because we don't always use those hands." The classroom fell quiet. As Warren watched Sandra, he realized, today, he had met someone who truly made people think. When the bell rang, no one moved. Warren took a deep breath. "Well said, Sandra." Sandra smiled slightly. "Thank you, Professor." Slowly, students got up from their seats. Most of them were still reflecting on the conversation between Sandra and Warren. Jessica scribbled something in her notebook, then walked over to Sandra. "I've never thought about it that way before." Sandra smiled. "Thinking isn't a bad thing." Jessica nodded, glancing at Warren. The professor was still standing at the podium. As Sandra headed for the door, she turned back. "See you next class, Professor." Warren nodded. "Yes, Sandra. See you then." No one had won today, but something had changed, and sometimes that was enough. Warren stood alone at the podium. As the students trickled out one by one, he remained in place. Today's debate hadn't ended with the usual victory he was accustomed to. But it wasn't a defeat either. The professor took a deep breath. Sandra's words echoed in his mind. Maybe we're the ones who need to make them feel it. Such a simple sentence, yet it carried an unexpected weight. He slipped his hand into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against a small metal key he had carried for years. An insignificant object, but now it stirred an old memory. Years ago, he had stood in a hospital corridor, waiting. A doctor had told him, "We did everything we could." That day, he had lost his faith completely. His prayers had gone unanswered. From that moment on, he had relied solely on reason, believing that science explained everything. But Sandra's words made him question that belief. God hasn't abandoned us. We're the ones who abandon each other. He took a step forward. Looking out the window, he saw Sandra outside, chatting with a few students. Their laughter carried through the crisp afternoon air. She stood among them naturally, effortlessly. She wasn't there to win. She was there to understand. Warren hesitated for a moment, then stepped away from the podium. He hadn't been able to answer Sandra today, but next time he would be ready. As he walked out the door, a strange lightness settled over him. Maybe Sandra was right. Maybe some answers weren't found in arguments or theories. Maybe they were found in the way we chose to make a difference in someone else's life. And maybe just asking the question was a start. But there's something I've noticed. You still haven't subscribed. And honestly, that hurts. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.